Welcome to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. People's Republic originates on KOOP Austin and is also syndicated on WHIV New Orleans. I'm your host, Brian Griffith, and here's what's going down in your backyard and across the world. This week we are discussing various kind of world events. We're kicking off the first half of the show. We're first trying to talk about kind of the Trump press conference, the response to the two mass shootings, and generally get into the issues of the shootings themselves. And then we're going to try and get into a little bit of the Democratic debates, Democratic Party infrastructure, and the ridiculous corporate media. So all of that is coming up on this next half hour. We are joined for this segment by Jacqueline Luqman, who's one of the co-editors-in-chief of Luqman Nation, as well as a journalist with the Real News as well. I think I'm probably missing a couple things. I know you're on quite a bit, but thank you very much, Jackie, for coming on.
No, thanks so much for having me back, Brian. We love being on your show.
Yeah, always so glad to have you. We always have such really, I think, important conversations. So let's get into, first of all, Trump's press conference. I have not had a chance to, I heard it kind of coming in, we're recording this the morning of August 5th. So this is just the day, basically 24 hours after the shootings. What sort of is kind of your take?
Well, the thing that people are making a big deal about is that Trump actually said the words, "The nation needs to confront racism, bigotry, and white supremacy." And people are falling over themselves, giving him credit for saying that. But this is the same man who laughed and made jokes about his supporters, saying that the only way to stop immigrants was to shoot them. And he said at one of his rallies when his supporters said that was, the only place, maybe in Florida is the only place you can get away with that. Ha ha ha. He said of himself that he could shoot someone in the middle of the Fifth Avenue and not lose a supporter when he was campaigning. He's called immigrants, people coming to the southern border specifically seeking asylum. He's called them animals. He's called them rapists. He has called people seeking asylum at the southern border an invasion repeatedly. So here's a man who has used white supremacist, bigoted, xenophobic, racist language to dehumanize immigrants, specifically immigrants coming to the country at the southern border. But now people, and he's done this for years and years. He's done this for years. And this is on top of the things that he has said before he even became president, when he was sued for racial discrimination in housing in New York, when he took out full-page ads to call now the exonerated five, who were formerly the Central Park Five, called them animals, and to say that they should be executed and to uphold their guilt, even in the face of their innocence being proven. This is a man who has a long track record of racism. And now people are falling over themselves, giving him credit, trying to give him credit because he said some words and has not backed up any of those words with action. So that in itself, it amazes me. Well, it shouldn't amaze me, but it sort of does, how easily placated some people are by just people saying some words rather than actual action. That's the first issue that I have with his press conference and the response to it. The second issue is that he pivoted from that and immediately started talking about mental illness pulls the trigger, and it's video games, and it's the breakdown in society. And it's like, no, this is not mental illness. This is white supremacist terrorist violence. It's what it is.
That's absolutely, I don't know, just the fact that we're still trying to talk about mental illness is absolutely bizarre to me. It's absolutely like this should not, somehow this should never have been the conversation, because first of all, I'm thinking of all the people I know who struggle with mental illness. I'm thinking, like, I've struggled with mental illness. Like everyone, I mean, I would say almost everyone I know has been mentally ill the same way most people have been physically ill at some point. And the vast majority of people with mental illness never go out and shoot somebody. That's never something that even crosses their mind. It's incredible, but I think in many ways the timbre for that, and the fact that that's the acceptable bar for what this, the national conversation on these shootings are, because I mean, we can understand these shootings to be an epidemic. As far as nationally, people I think have struggled to understand what the source of this epidemic is, because we're getting so many kind of narratives that aren't fitting what's actually going on. So it's like for a long time we did get, this is something like sort of out of mass culture, whether it's either the violent movies or violent video games. And I think really that's kind of reverse. Like they both, like it is something cultural with regard to mass shootings for sure, but it's not being caused by the mass culture. Rather, the mass culture is coming from the same root as whatever's causing these mass shootings. Like why are we so violent as a culture is sort of like what, we need to get down to what that root is. And I think most people, in a way that they just sort of judging from most, like not really kind of leftist people, but just like liberal people I know and kind of just people in the center I know, I think they understand this very much to be about white supremacy. I don't think there's any question in a lot of people's minds like, oh yeah, this is white supremacist. It's not about mental illness. It's not about video games. It's not about really even, I don't think many people are kind of saying that this is about sort of like a decontextualized just guns in general. Although, like again, the gun control debate should remain on the kind of table, but like people understand it's not guns in general, it's not mental illness, it's not all of these things, but this is clearly a case of white supremacist violence, white supremacist terrorism. And but I think in many ways, like the Democrats have sort of set this up by making those other things sort of the only things they can talk about with regard to responding to these mass shootings.
Yeah. And I think you bring up a good point in the Democrats' complicity in this, because they have been horrible in confronting this very thing. I mean, we can talk about how this president and this GOP in its current iteration doesn't want to admit its racism, but the Democratic Party has never wanted, well, I shouldn't say never, has not wanted to confront the same issues within its own party and in this country in its history as a whole. I mean, there is a candidate for president right now who is having his record of working with white supremacists in Congress being dragged out into the light, because it needs to be. And this guy is a Democrat, Joe Biden.
Yeah. And
we've got Democrats telling us that Biden is the best chance that we have to beat Trump. But how are we going to beat one white supremacist with another white supremacist? That just makes no sense. And the idea that people would deflect, whether it's Trump or anybody else who wants to make these white supremacist terrorist rampages about mental illness, that is, you're right, an insult to people who suffer with mental illness or experience some type of mental illness. Because exactly like you said, plenty of people experience some type of mental stress or mental illness and don't go out and massacre a bunch of people. As a matter of fact, most people don't. Most mentally ill people don't. But then it also deflects the responsibility away from the issue, because then it becomes, well, this is not an issue of white supremacist hatred. Now it's an issue of, oh, these people are sick and they need help. And that's a real problem, where you deflect what the GOP always harps on when it comes to Black people and Black people's behavior. when you deflect from the personal responsibility of these white supremacists and you don't hold them accountable for their actual hatred and bigotry.
The other thing is like the fact that, and again, like I always kind of bring up the Democrats on these things because like we understand the Republicans to be despicable. We start from a basis of the Republicans are despicable. We start from the basis that like Trump absolutely is a white supremacist in his actions, in his rhetoric. He is fanned the flames. He is essentially what people could call incited violence. I think there's a good case he incited violence against Ilhan Omar, and it was it was interesting to me how like the Democrats, the kind of corporate Democrats, Nancy Pelosi couldn't even bring herself to call Trump racist after she herself was one of the most vocal critics of Ilhan Omar, kind of making up this fake anti-Semitism charge when Ilhan Omar had the quote unquote audacity to make basic to make just the absolute most basic case against the Israel lobby, basically saying that the Israel lobby, like has influence in Washington and calling that a bad thing, and it is. And so that was the quote unquote anti-Semitism that Nancy Pelosi and others in the Democratic Party harped on to basically fan the flames of saying that Ilhan Omar is like an extremist, a racist, et cetera, et cetera. That was a rhetoric coming out of the Democratic Party. It wasn't until Trump also joined in those attacks, and Trump himself said that Nancy on Twitter got and tweeted that said Nancy Pelosi is great. She's not racist at all. That's coming from Trump. So I think, birds of a feather and whatnot. And so it wasn't until he himself joined in the rhetoric against Ilhan Omar that Nancy Pelosi felt the need to even mount the most basic defense of Ilhan Omar. And even then she used the word racist, but she later clarified that she wasn't calling Trump racist. She was calling his words racist, leaving room for him to have this redemption moment that I guess Nancy Pelosi thinks that Trump is going to have. She clapped along, thinking about his kind of racist demagogic State of the Union this past year. She clapped along heartily. She was right behind him, clapping to everything he said about, immigrants, about his like ridiculous warlike foreign policy, and his just attacks on the left and on socialism. She was clapping along to every bit, and she can't bring herself to call Trump racist. And it just speaks to, I think, the absolute collaborationist nature, I think, of this, what you might call the corporate wing of the Democratic Party, which largely controls the Democratic Party infrastructure. I don't know. It's just frustrating to me that, like, again, circling back around to these shootings that have happened, when the shooter this white supremacist shooter puts out a manifesto that specifically is blaming immigrants, where he talks about how bad race mixing is, quote unquote race mixing. Basically he is echoing every part of Trump's rhetoric. He says in his manifesto that predates Trump, but obviously it's Trump that tapped into this. It's Trump that is sparking this. When you have people essentially committing these shootings in Trump's name, and I think everyone I know recognizes Trump to be a racist, and it's just like people can't even, the Democratic Party and the corporate media can't even bring themselves to use the word racist, much less white supremacist, much less fascist when they're talking about Trump's sort of actions and rhetoric here, just because he's able to get on stage, he's able to say a thing about mental illness, and once he actually uses the word racism, he's somehow absolved. It just, I don't know. I don't know that I have a question here. It's just frustrating. I hate it.
Yeah, it is. It is. I think the conversation that we on the left, especially in the Black community and other marginalized communities, have is, at what point do you stop just engaging with these people? Because it doesn't matter what happens. It doesn't matter how many white supremacists come out and kill a bunch of people and come right out and say, I am going to kill, or I plan to kill all of these people because I think they are a threat to my existence as a white, straight, cis male person. I mean, there are always going to be people who crawl out of the, well, that not crawl out of the woodwork. There are always going to be people who use their platform that was given to them by the people who voted for them and confirm exactly what we've been saying all along, that people with these racist, white supremacist, anti-gay, anti-trans, xenophobic views, anti-Semitic, Islamophobic views are all throughout our government. And at what point are we going to be honest and recognize these people for exactly who and what they are and vote them out of office and let them go and live out their lives in their hateful obscurity? I mean, in response to these terrorist murders, an Ohio congresswoman posted on her Facebook page that these murders were actually the result of, she blames the shootings on gay marriage, video games, open borders, trans lifestyle. And she's already in office. People already voted for this woman. Do we really believe that she has never expressed these kinds of attitudes before? Sure, she has. That's why some people voted for her. And at what point do we on the left finally just admit, look, and especially those who call themselves progressives, those white people on the left who call themselves progressives, but who always want to work with so-called the alt-right and want to try to have a dialogue with these people, at what point do they just say, you know what? Those people are honestly despicable. They are white supremacists. They're transphobic. They're homophobic. They're Islamophobic. And we have nothing to do with them. We want nothing to do with them. Let's call them out for what and who they are. And then let's just move on to someone better who represents the interests of all people. But we can never do that if we're not willing to be honest about what's right there in front of us.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're just tuning in, you're listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. People's Republic originates on KOOP 91.7 FM and is also broadcast on WHIV 102.3 FM. We are available as a podcast on SoundCloud, Spreaker, Spotify, Stitcher, iTunes, wherever podcasts are podded. We're talking with Jackie Luqman, who's a co-editor-in-chief of Luqman Nation, as well as a journalist with The Real News. I'd like to now kind of pivot a little bit, again, because so much of this is about understanding both sides of the quote unquote sides of the political spectrum here. So I'd also like to bring up a little bit about the Democratic debates and sort of where, because so much of I feel like the national conversation has shifted in some ways, but we're seeing this amazingly kind of reactionary with this last set of Democratic debates, this amazingly reactionary rhetoric by the kind of CNN host there, that it's like, it's amazing to me, I guess, that CNN gets considered to be the neutral network, the kind of one that's like not to the left, not to the right. This is sort of the center. If this is the center, and I don't buy this argument, but if CNN were the center, we're in a bad place. If Jake Tapper and Don Lemon are the political center of the world, we're in a horrifying place. But I don't think that's the case. So yeah, maybe you can, maybe as someone who's like kind of closely studied, I watch them, but I know you've kind of studied these, for your segments, for your journalism. Maybe you can kind of give us the rundown of like what your analysis is on like where, kind of how CNN tried to frame this conversation and how the different Democrat candidates responded.
I mean, there was so much in this this second round of Democratic debates, and I'm almost extra depressed because there are going to be more of them. I don't know how much more of this I can take. I mean, the questions, as a journalist, it boggled my mind. As a journalist and as a political analyst, it boggled my mind that Jake Tapper seriously asked the question, Why should a nuclear first strike be off the table? And I thought, of all of the manifestations of the four horsemen of the apocalypse that could have been, I never would have thought Jake Tapper would be one of them. I could not believe he asked that question in sincerity. But then again, I had to remember that a part of, and this does tie into what we talked about previously, a part of white supremacy, the global system of white supremacy, is military imperialism, or imperialism that is implemented through military oppression, really. And so it's not surprising that this so-called, CNN kind of calls itself like an unbiased kind of media outlet, but it's not. It is owned by one of the 6, maybe it's down to 5 now, entities that own every media outlet. And all of those 5 entities are heavily tied into maintaining this imperialist, global, capitalist status quo. And the only way this system can maintain itself around the world is through military domination of other nations that are militarily and economically weaker than we are. And we want to keep them that way. So I think we're at the point now where, like, the mask is off of one of those horsemen of the apocalypse, a war, so that people who, even among the Democrats, are fine with continuing endless war, not only continuous endless war, but escalating it to seriously considering a nuclear first strike against Iran, a country that has not violated the nuclear agreement that it entered into with the Obama administration. I mean, the masks are off now. So this is another one of those instances where we have to see these people for who we are. And every Democratic candidate on that stage who answered in some variation of, well, no, I wouldn't take anything off the table, they're a threat too. They're as much of a threat as we believe the GOP to be.
Yeah, and there are a lot of threads I want to follow here as someone who looks a lot at geopolitics. I don't know that I have time for all of them, but first of all, the kind of the different states around the world that the U.S. considers to be threats are absolutely ludicrous. If you kind of have a more sober analysis of what it is, for instance, the DPRK, also known as North Korea, or Iran, have actually sort of done. So if you look, Iran has not invaded a country, I think, in several hundred years. It's been a very long time since Iran has actually engaged in a kind of military threat. So the U.S. has kind of bolstered the fear-mongering around quote-unquote Iran proxies. That is to say that, again, basically any sort of resistance force, regardless of kind of its own class or ethnic character or religious character, really, or lack of religious character, basically any sort of resistance force, whether that's the Houthis in Yemen, whether that's Hezbollah in Lebanon, or whether that's Hamas or other sort of Palestinian resistance groups, any sort of resistance to basically the U.S., Saudi, and Israeli kind of axis within the Middle East, any sort of group that's putting up any sort of fight whatsoever is kind of automatically labeled as as a quote unquote proxy of Iran without really any sort of evidence to kind of back up those claims. We see nothing of the sort. Like, for instance, Saudi Arabia somehow is not this sort of a threat to world peace, even as they threaten the lives of millions of Yemenis, even as they cause these devastating wars and whatnot. With the DPRK, and of course you can Google very quickly, or you can use your other search engine of choice. I prefer DuckDuckGo because it doesn't track you as much as Google.
Right.
But very side note there, very tangential. But you can look very quickly at a map of the U.S. military bases and installed around Iran. Iran has nothing of the sort. with regard to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, Iran was the only country for a long time that was in compliance with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And what have they gotten for it? Well, the U.S. unilaterally pulled out. The U.S. Then imposed these massive sanctions designed to destroy I almost said Venezuelan, destroy the Iranian economy, same way as the sanctions that have destroyed the Venezuelan economy. And so, for having the audacity again to try and develop their own economy, they're getting hit with this kind of U.S. militarism, this U.S. warmongering, where even those who were in favor, even those within Iran who were saying we need to negotiate with the U.S., are now getting essentially sanctioned by the U.S. So the quote unquote reformists within the country or whatnot are getting sanctioned by the Trump administration. So it's clear with the U.S. Iran relationship, it's like the U.S. does not want to work with any force within Iran. The U.S. goal is now just the complete destruction of the country. And for Jake Tapper to come out and, essentially try and frame that in terms of why are you leaving the U.S. vulnerable? Why don't you let us do this first strike is ridiculous. Same thing, to touch on briefly on the other country that we hear about so much every time it does even the most basic missile test, the DPRK, also known as North Korea. The U.S. has been doing joint military exercises and installing missile bases just miles from North Korea. The U.S. actually, like the existence of South Korea, is predicated on the U.S. essentially arbitrarily dividing the country and installing a longtime military dictatorship, one of the most military dictatorship there, one of the most oppressive military dictatorships in the world for many decades. That's talking about South Korea, and that's what the U.S. did in order essentially to again divide up a state, a socialist state that was the entirety of Korea. That was divided up on this sort of premise of, we have to protect ourselves from communism. So they installed a fascist dictatorship that is now not today known as South Korea, because there have been some reforms there where, I think Moon Jae-in has been really pushing toward a reunification. But anyway, those are the stories you don't get. The fact that the Koreas themselves are in many ways united, the peoples of both Koreas are united against this kind of U.S. military threat. And they don't, like, the people of South Korea are not afraid of North Korean missiles. They're afraid of the U.S. Doing something ridiculous. Anyway, that's a long sort of a geopolitical, I think, setup there. It's just, I actually, going back to an earlier point, I could absolutely have imagined Jake Tapper as one of the four horsemen, one of the four harbingers of the apocalypse, following his rhetoric. Adam Johnson of Citations Needed and of fair.org contributor has a great episode of Citations Needed specifically on what he calls the faux adversarialism of Jake Tapper, where Tapper sort of sets up this kind of makes it seem like he's asking very serious journalistic questions when in reality it's nothing but just kind of far right-wing talking points. And I think one other point that I'd like to mention on just this CNN part is just thinking back to Don Lemon. I don't think anyone actively watches CNN. I think it's on in airports everywhere, so people are aware of CNN existing, and they'll tune in when something like this happens. But I don't think, for instance, most people would know that Don Lemon, I forget the exact, he interviewed at one point a couple years back this prominent Muslim lawyer, this kind of high profile, Muslim, I think civil rights or human rights lawyer, and just randomly asked him the question out of the blue whether this guy supported ISIS. And it's just an absurd, just tone deaf. Tone deaf is all hell question out of nowhere. So these are the absolute right wing buffoons that led these debates. It was even less watchable to me than the Maddow hosting the MSNBC debates. It sucks. It's awful. And this is the second time I think I've said this. I just hate it. I don't really want to get into this whole kind of meta narrative too much of quote unquote who's winning the debates, who came out good, who came out bad. But how do you think these debates, I think, are really kind of shaping national conversations that are happening? Like we're seeing, I think, a lot more kind of range. The Overton window has expanded a lot more since 2016. How do you feel kind of people are standing up with regard to like their principles and their platforms?
I mean, I think for the candidates that people have been paying attention to since 2016, as Sanders and Warren, they've been who they've been. I think Sanders, isn't going to change much, which is a good thing, and it's also not a great thing, especially when it comes to Black issues and specifically the issue of reparations. I think other candidates do better at giving lip service on some of those issues than Sanders does, but they're all of the candidates, with I think the exception of Julian Castro, who I wish he were more assertive on that stage, but again, I think that we have to keep in mind that the corporate entities don't want certain candidates to get a lot of airtime. So they just don't call on a lot of candidates. And they give a lot of other candidates who honestly should not even be on the stage, like Delaney and Bullock from the first night. I didn't understand why those people talked as much as they did. But then I had to remember who was hosting the debates. So they filled up a lot of time with a lot of fluff from a lot of candidates that really are not going to matter, because they're not going to be in the next round, and they're certainly not going to be among those who will be the candidates to be decided upon for the nomination. But I think you can kind of more clearly see in the second debate the candidates who might be taken a little bit more seriously as far as actually having thought out policies, whether they're sincere in some of the things they said or not. Like, I think Christian Gillibrand's comments about as a white woman, she is in a better position to use her privilege to speak to white female Trump voters and confront them on their white privilege. I think that needed to be said. We can have a whole conversation about whether she's sincere or not, and then we can have a separate conversation about whether it's actually going to work. I don't think it will, but the fact that it was said on that debate stage, I think, is important. So you're right. The discourse is being pushed in certain areas that it needs to be pushed in. But at the same time, this is the Democratic Party. All of these candidates are there supporting, trying to get the nomination for the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party is still very much controlled by corporate interests and the defense industry, and very much the pro-Zionist faction of the Israel lobby. So there's only so much real change that those factions are going to allow within the Democratic Party. So, if you're going to if your vote is going to be down to whether you're going to vote for a Democrat or a Republican, we know who the Republicans are. It doesn't even matter that they haven't had their debates yet. We know who they are. But I think among the choices for Democratic candidates, I think we've got a clearer picture. But as a leftist, for me, they all come up short for different reasons.
Yeah, I think I would absolutely second that. I've for various reasons. Again, I don't really endorse any of these people. Both sort of as a journalist, I feel like it doesn't make sense for me to kind of endorse somebody as I'm trying to do this analysis. But then just I don't know who I would endorse out of this, because it feels like it feels like everybody's really missing so much. Like, it would be so easy, I think, for some of the candidates who are posturing as progressives to just sort of push themselves a little bit farther, and they're just so reluctant to do that. We see Sanders over and over again just kind of refusing to sort of engage in a meaningful way with kind of like racial issues, with really like a refusal, I think, to acknowledge the sort of like white supremacist nature of whether it's the Republican Party or whether it's the U.S. at large. And like I've heard him kind of say some things about the military-industrial complex, for instance. But you look at his own voting record, and he's he's voted in many ways for the exact same wars that all the other Republicans and the corporate Democrats have. He's been kind of pushed to make that a thing that he talks about. But again, it's how sincere are these candidates? First of all, what sort of could they actually do? On the other hand, like what as president, how much can you really change the U.S. empire from within? And I think as leftists, we both understand the answer pretty well, that the presidency in some ways is more of a public relations arm of the military to some degree. I think that's a kind of easy way of putting it, that there's only so much you can actually do, even if you were president, even if you had the Congress behind you. There's a reason it's called the military-industrial complex, because it functions kind of autonomously. These kind of arms of the state function in many ways autonomously outside of the kind of civilian control or oversight. So it's like, what difference? I mean, it's important for sure that people bring up these things. It's important that these things are getting this sort of public visibility, where somebody now has to say these things, or where like these corporate Democrats, I think in many ways, are kind of putting on these Bernie Sanders wigs and sort of ranting about billionaires and whatnot, whether they're serious about it or not. Like the national conversation, I think, has shifted. It hasn't shifted. It shifted, I think, in some degree because Bernie Sanders appeared when he did in 2016, but largely it shifted because of the mass movements that have happened. It shifted because the conditions are so bad for people in this country, because I think people are suffering both from economic exploitation as well as all these other forms of oppression, racial and gender, and sexuality and whatnot. Like, essentially things have gotten to such a degree, and it happened so fast that the conversation shifted because of these mass movements that arose in response to this. So I think for those people who are thinking about these different presidential candidates, rather than thinking of like, oh, which one gets me the most, again, even assuming you want to vote for a Democrat, rather than sort of this framing of like which one can kind of move the needle most, which one can do the most good as president. Instead, I think it makes so much more sense to be thinking about sort of like, how do we build this sort of like power and like real workers' infrastructure and oppressed people's infrastructure outside the Democratic Party that can, really shift not just the conversation, but shift the actions. I'm kind of thinking specifically of the fact that, like, for instance, who was it who ended the Vietnam War? Technically, it was Richard Nixon. It was the absolutely despicable Richard Nixon. Who normalized relations with China? It was Richard Nixon. Was it because Richard Nixon was that much of just a progressive-minded person? No, absolutely not. But the conversation was such, and the balance of power, I think, was such in the country at that point, that the massive anti-war movement, the massive kind of anti-imperialist movement, and the kind of socialist and communist movements were strong enough that, in addition to like the global balance of power with regard to there being a lot of strong socialist states, that Nixon had no choice but to end the Vietnam War and to normalize relations with China, that it forced the hand of the U.S. empire. And so for people thinking, in terms of who do I want to vote for, who do I want to give my support to with regard to whether it's Democrat or independent or whatnot, instead, I think it's far more important to sort of open up that to really expand that conversation to like where can I guess best put my efforts, where can what sort of mass mobilization is actually necessary to bring about the changes, and hopefully the kind of more like revolutionary change that people really need to see. Yeah, I'm wondering your thoughts just generally on all that.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting time because, I mean, this kind of how do I say this? It's like social media has been this great gift for us leftists, right? Because we are able to disseminate all of this information on all of this stuff that you just mentioned, this history that has been kind of siloed before now, and it's been sort of in the hands of the intellectuals and the old anti-war and anti-imperialists and the Black radicals of the past, and you had to be either in those communities or in proximity to those communities to get that information. But now all you need is an internet connection, and you're connected to the right people with you can connect to people and podcasts and pages who share this information freely, and that's great. On the other hand, I think what Martin Luther King Jr. said about how we organize is still true, even in the face of this great tool of social media, where we can share and disseminate all of this great information that should honestly radicalize. And I have never looked at radicalization as a bad word, because we should all be radical in pursuing justice and dismantling this system. That's not, radical is not a bad thing. The status quo is a horrible thing, and it's killing us all. So I think, and I'm paraphrasing what MLK said a little bit, that the forces of evil do a better job of organizing their time than the forces of good. And I think that's still true, because on the left, we're having to do a lot of arguing among ourselves about, should we work with the alt-right? We had to do that a few years ago. Should we deal with are these terrorist, these acts of white supremacist terrorist violence, are they really false flags? Are they really activities of the deep state? We've got to argue with this kind of stuff among the left, because the same social media that is a tool that we could use to educate people, to push them to understand this system more and to become more organized and mobilized. Instead, people are sharing this ridiculous stuff that's actually fracturing us to some degree and distracting us with silly things like, the shooter in Ohio is the same person who was the shooter at the Garlic Festival. I literally saw this 4 times on my own timeline, shared by different people over the past 2 days. It's a really interesting and really frustrating time where, yes, I think there is this resurgence of a robust anti-war movement, a robust and a diverse anti-war movement in this country that has very much been propelled by a lot of online activity. And I think that's great. There's been a lot of support and in many ways that people have been able to get together and organize and mobilize against ICE and the detention facilities. Black Lives Matter has obviously grown and has become very influential because of social media. And I don't think would have really without it the way it has now. And that's a great thing. And more people are identifying themselves as leftists outside of the Democratic Party and are getting in touch with terms like socialism and Marxism. And the stigma around those terms are lessening because of social media. That's fabulous. But we're still having to combat a lot of ridiculous ignorance too because of social media. So you've got that fight, and then you have to deal with the very appealing milquetoast message from the moderate Democrats, and how for a lot of people who are still very reticent to identify with socialism or to identify themselves as leftists and certainly don't want to be identified as Marxists, the moderate Democratic message is very appealing precisely because on the other end of the spectrum, this current administration and the GOP is so horrendous. So, I mean, these debates ultimately will serve to make people more comfortable with the idea of the least threatening Democrat being their best bet in beating this administration. I think that's what these debates will serve to do. And like I said, that I think that's what the establishment Democrats want.
Is there a clear, like, least threatening Democrat that's emerging? Because I feel like, I mean, that for a while was Joe Biden, for sure. He entered the race with essentially, you know, that sort of like, oh, we can just return to the Obama administration. Like, let's just undo all this and let's just have this guy who I remember from the Obama administration. I'm sort of amazed he's not sunk yet. I'm really just amazed that, like, with what's come out about his record, both in terms of his voting record, his is just active, you know, just anti-women record, and just, like, his absolute racism defense of Strom Thurmond. I mean, the dude is like, it's just incredible that he's kind of failed upward his entire career, and that he's able to, like, in this age where so much of this stuff should be completely unacceptable, where, like, this open defense of Strom Thurmond would be, I would think, a disqualifier, or like the you know, just general creepiness at every sort of level. His policies, his rhetoric, and his personal actions and personal conduct has just been a despicable human being. And for him to just continue to be, like, chugging along, and for him to supposedly be the front runner just blows my mind, because I don't know anyone like. I know so many people kind of, you know, across the political spectrum, from, like, you know, sort of like liberal-ish people, leftist people. I know conservative people. I don't hang around, like, Trump supporters or whatnot, but I know a bunch of conservative people, and, like, nobody anywhere in that spectrum is like, yeah, Joe Biden's my guy. So, like, for him to be the front runner, especially after his record has been revealed, is just truly bizarre to me.
Well, I think that of the people that I actually know, and who say that they will vote for Joe Biden if, you know, they actually want him to be the nominee, their reason for saying that is not because they like the guy. They actually hate him. They actually hate him. They hate his policies. They hate his record. These are people who actually didn't like that Obama chose him as the nominee, as his vice president, because they knew some of his record, but they had so much hope in Obama that they figured, and people literally said this to me, Biden is the vice president. How much more damage is he going to do as vice president? So these are some of the same people who are saying to me, no, I really don't like Joe Biden. I know what he did in the Anita Hill, the Clarence Thomas hearings with Anita Hill. I know how he treated her. I know he's creepy. I know, you know, I know his vote, you know, his involvement with the crime bill, with the 94 crime bill. And usually that's as much as people know. A lot of people didn't know just how far back Biden's despicableness went and how deep it was. But even with that, people are really saying to me, I know he's bad, I hate him, but I hate Trump worse. I hate Trump more. So I will vote for someone who I do not like and who I am deeply suspicious of in order to get rid of this person who I outright hate and who I am absolutely terrified of is going to kill us all. That really is the logic that a lot of people have. And that is what the Democratic Party is banking on. They're not banking on people saying, you know what, I have an opportunity to demand that this party implement some real change and not get in the way of a nomination for a Bernie Sanders, understanding that I'm not endorsing Sanders, and I'm not saying that Sanders is a great candidate, but he is better on some policies than the establishment Democratic Party candidates are. I want to make that clear. But people are so afraid of what they know to be the very virulent, going right back to the beginning of the conversation, white supremacist, anti-immigrant, anti-gay, transphobic, Islamophobic, anti-Semitic base of the GOP that comes out and votes every single time in every election. They don't vote for any particular candidate. They vote for what they're against. And they've proven themselves to be reliable in that. So the Democratic Party is banking on people being so afraid of them that people will vote for a bad Democrat before they will vote for a Democratic candidate who will actually move the party back to the left.
Yeah, it's 2016 all over again. It's like the only their message is all just we're not Trump. Like you gotta, I mean, at least with Obama, even though he was essentially a neoliberal empty suit in his policies, even though he essentially like his crowning domestic policy achievement was passing Mitt Romney's Republican healthcare plan. Obama, at least during his campaign and during his during his run for presidency, actually, you know, at least tried to like bring people in and say, like, we can do this together. There was a yes, we can message. Whether he was sincere about that, there was something he was trying to mobilize. And like with this, with like these current candidates, it really just is we're not Trump. That's it. There's nothing that someone like Joe Biden stands for other than we're not Trump. And the only way I think these people are able to maintain this like even feasibility, because like again, they don't have a popular base of support anywhere, is through this constant, like these essentially 30 plus years of media meta commentary, which I think started in sort of the early 90s or so, where they started talking about essentially electability. It was this meta commentary coming from cable news, where essentially they would tell you like, they would tell you things like, oh, yes, this candidate, this kind of like left-leaning candidate, they have some of these more old school ideas of what the government should be like, this kind of like social welfare program or whatnot. But, we're in a different time, and this is the most electable candidate here. Like the viewer, you might think that this person here has kind of views, but that person doesn't have the policy smarts to be able to pass those views. What we need, the more electable candidate, the one that's going to appeal to more voters, even though you, a viewer and a voter, might prefer this candidate because of their policy. Instead, we need to tell you as the cable media that this person is more electable. This person has the more mass appeal. So therefore, you, the voter, now like essentially like trying to get people to change their votes for the person that they're told is most electable because they're kind of in on the political game or whatnot. And so that's where we are. It's like we're told these candidates are more electable, even though nobody wants to elect them.
Exactly. So this whole electability argument that the media, again, the corporate media, is propping up, really is just it's just, and this is one of the few times I'm going to use this term, it really is just kind of a psyop by the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
To convince people that horrible, crappy candidates who are not actually going to do much for people are better for them than what even the people who are voting know. It's just, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a few minutes left. I'm wondering, if you have any kind of final takeaways, things we didn't get to talk about, because there's always just kind of so much to talk about with all this. If there's anything else with regard to these different Democrat candidates, with regard to just generally the state of American political affairs, that you feel needs highlighting that isn't getting the sort of coverage it needs to be.
One interesting thing that is happening that I think is not being, I think maybe it's not being explained well, or I'm not sure how to frame it, but I think the conversation among some Democratic candidates about socialism is both kind of welcome, but it's also as warped as everything else the Democratic Party does, right? It's like socialism is now being talked about in the open outside of the framework of democratic socialism, which is, supposed to be the less scary brand of socialism. But it's obviously not discussed correctly, because people in this country don't know what socialism is. Because if we did, we'd want it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But at the same time, so the same people who are speaking, if not less negatively about socialism with a small s, are some of the same people who are still demonizing the few remaining socialist governments around the world that are fighting against U.S. imperialism that has been incessantly trying to destroy their governments. And these are governments in Venezuela, in Cuba, and in other countries where those governments have operated on behalf of the people in those countries, doing things for people in those countries that we are fighting for here. And we don't make the connection that we're still calling Nicolas Maduro a dictator and a monster, but in Venezuela, every school kid gets a laptop furnished by the government, right? and in Venezuela, the government earlier this year just completed the first part of a multi-phase program where the government built housing for its people, 2.5 million units of free and affordable housing for working people. Here, people can't afford, let's just say that the homeless crisis in Los Angeles alone, and in the Los Angeles area alone, is at epidemic proportions. And I'm not surprised that the media isn't covering it, because it is a stain on this country. Homelessness is on the rise in this country, and the only time people ever bring up homelessness is when they want to talk about homeless veterans, and that's always in the context of, well, if we're going to do anything for anybody in this country, if we're going to do free stuff, why can't we give homeless veterans? Why can't we take care of homeless veterans? Where in countries that we continue to demonize are providing housing for people in their countries, because housing is a human right. Education is a human right. But in this country, we're still talking about how are we going to get rid of contaminated water in public schools. So I think this whole conversation about what we want our government to do for us is still very much in its infancy, I think. Yeah, that's the right term I want to use in this country. We're still framing that discussion about what this government in this country should do for its people. Is still a very immature conversation, to the point where we will talk about things like socialism, but we will water those terms down to the most ineffective, immature definitions that they literally don't mean anything here anymore. But in other countries around the world, that is literally how governments take care of its people.
We have been joined for this episode for the full hour by Jackie Luqman, who's the co-editor, one of the co-editors in chief of Luqman Nation, as well as a regular journalist with The Real News. Thank you very much, Jackie, for returning to the show once again. Always a pleasure to have you.
Always a pleasure to join you.
That's all we have for this week. You have been listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. People's Republic originates on KOOP Austin and is also available as a podcast on Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX for more news and analysis. We are out of here.